Okay, so welcome everybody. Happy Monday. And we are continuing our study of the book of Shemuel. We're in Shemuel Aleph. We're up to chapter 19. We're at the heart of the stories which portray the conflict between Shaul, the current king, but who has been prophesied to have his kingdom taken away from him, and David HaMelech, who will be the next king, who's already been anointed, but nobody knows it yet. Shaul and David have quite a complicated, intense relationship, and that's only going to escalate now in this chapter, in chapter 19. To get us back into the swing of things, in the last chapter, in chapter 18, we saw Shaul went through a few different trials to end David's life. We saw him in sort of hidden ways, not exposing himself, try to kill David, who he views now as his nemesis, as his arch enemy, because he kind of senses that David is going to be the one to take his place on the throne as king of the Jewish people. So he went through a few different trials. He first tried to kill him when his back was turned to him. David didn't realize, and it didn't happen. And then he tried to put him on the front lines against the Philistines, and nothing happened. David was successful. And then he marries him off to his daughter and tells him that as a dowry, you have to go kill 100 Philistines, thinking that David would not be able to do it. David not only kills 100, he kills 200, and he ends up marrying his daughter. So Shaul has tried a few times as the evil father-in-law to get rid of his son-in-law David, and to no avail. In this chapter, we're going to see that he ups the ante and outwardly tries to kill David several times, eventually leading to David having to flee, having to run away from Shaul's presence. And we'll see what happens, and this situation will only get more and more tense as we continue to read through. Admittedly, chapter 19 is, for me, one of the most weird chapters of the entire story. There's a lot of strange things that take place over here. We'll try and break it down and talk a little bit about it and see where we come to. So we're in Shemuel Aleph, chapter 19. If you have this book, it's page 685. If you have this one. Yeah, same thing. You have page 685 in that book. What about the, or if you're in the Art Scroll Tanakh 692. So you can see the Tanakhs are kind of aligned, 685, 692. Question before we start from Esther. Go ahead.
David knows he's going to be king.
Yes.
Right? He was already anointed.
Yes.
Nobody else knows except for Shemuel.
Mm-hmm. Shemuel anointed him.
Right.
Why is it a secret? Well, it has to wait for the proper time, I guess, for David to step into the light. Or perhaps he's still going to wait for Shaul. David is not going to take his place on the throne until Shaul actually dies. So even though technically Shaul is not the king behind the scenes, he's been given that privilege has been given over to David. David will not take hold of the throne until after Shaul eventually dies. And that's going to happen all the way at the end of the book.
It's almost like they're making a fool of Shaul because David knows, and he's like, no, I'm not going to marry into the family. I'm not going to do this.
It seems a little bit that way. Like he's saying it's unfair to Shaul that somebody but it's hard to take somebody who was the king of Israel and then just put him as a regular citizen now. Like, what are you going to do, right? We're used to this, like when democratic leaders, like when the president of the United States stops being the president, he goes back to being a private citizen, but you kind of know that. As a king, that's a hard thing to do. There's really no transition out of being king to becoming a private citizen.
But that's why there should be some type of transition, because now it's just going to be, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to run away from you.
Right.
And like,
well, that wasn't the plan.
And how come David didn't say, oh, wait a minute.
That wasn't the plan. The plan was that it was supposed to pass down from Shaul to his children. That Shaul was supposed to hold on to it. It's because of the mistakes that he made that it got taken away from him. And maybe there's a hope here that Shaul will do the opposite. He'll take David under his wing. He'll mentor David. He'll say, look, it's not my son, but I have a good relationship with him. Let me give him whatever I have, and at least I'll be looked at as a positive figure in the end of the day. My legacy will lie with David, but he doesn't do it. Yeah, it's not the way of the land. It's asking a lot. No question, it's asking a lot. But
on the flip side, David is showing his humility by not throwing it in his face.
Yeah, David is playing it cool all the way through. He doesn't feel himself worthy even to be a part of Shaul's family. He still admires Shaul as the king until things go really, really sour. And even when things are in their worst of times between Shaul and David, David will still show the utmost honor to Shaul. He will have moments when David could kill Shaul and would be justified to do so because Shaul's trying to kill him, and he won't take advantage of those opportunities. In the next book, at the beginning of Shemuel Bet, we'll see David eulogize Shaul at the end of his life and offers one of the most moving, heartfelt eulogies for someone who spent half his life trying to kill him, right? So David definitely understands that something has gripped Shaul that is almost an out-of-body experience, this ruach hara'ah, this evil spirit, as we've said, that has gripped Shaul through the jealousy and all of the things that he has. David understands it's not him. And so David is trying to, tiptoe around him, hopefully ending the story without too much conflict. And you'll tell me when we get to the end of it what you think the ending sort of was. So page 685 in this Tanakh, we're up to chapter 19 here in Shemuel Aleph. Let's begin. Vaydaber Shaul el Yonatan beno ve'el kol avadav lehamit et David. So unlike the hidden tactics Shaul took in the last chapter to kill David, he now says to Yonatan, his son, and all of his servants, I want to kill David. In other words, Shaul is not hiding it anymore. V'Yonatan ben Shaul chafetz beDavid me'od. But what Shaul does not know is that Yonatan, that one is 692. What Shaul does not know is that Yonatan and David have a very positive bond, a very strong bond. We saw that at the beginning of chapter 18. Not only are they best friends, but they've made a covenant with each other. Yonatan, who should have taken over the throne as Shaul's son, almost saying to David, I want you to take it. And he's happy with him taking it. So Shaul tells Yonatan, I want to kill David. He doesn't realize Yonatan is David's best friend. So what does Yonatan do? Like any good friend would do. He tells David, Vayaged, verse 2, Vayaged Yonatan le David lemor. Yonatan goes to David and says to him, Mevakesh Shaul avi lahamitecha. My father Shaul desires to kill you. Ve'ata hisham erna baboker. Now I want you to be very careful in the morning. That's when he's going to strike. Ve'yashavta baseter v'nahbeta. And I want you to go into hiding and be in secret so that he cannot find you. Verse 3. Va'ani etze, I will go out, ve'amadti liyad avi, and I will stand by my father's side, basadeh asher atem sham, in the field where you are. So it sounds almost like Yonatan is setting up a scene where he's going to be walking with his father in the field, talking to him, and David is going to be close by in hiding, so Shaul doesn't know. And they're going to talk about David, and we're going to see what Shaul really thinks of David. It's almost like David wants to hear it from the horse's mouth directly that Shaul wants to kill him. Va'ani adaber becha el avi. Yonatan says, I'll speak about you to my father. V'ra'iti ma v'higadti lach. And we'll see what he says, and we'll tell over what it is. Let's see if maybe this was just a weird thing that he said. We'll test him again. Okay. What happens? And this is going to be, by the way, a little pattern we're going to see. David and Yonatan setting up these, I don't want to call them traps because they're not trying to trap him, but setting up these scenes of discussion with Shaul to see what are Shaul's real intentions, because they almost can't really believe that Shaul wants to pursue and kill David. David seemed to have a good relationship. David was his arms bearer. David was his harp player. They had a good relationship. So it's weird that now all of a sudden Shaul wants to kill him. Son-in-law, yeah. Yonatan plays it a little sneaky, and this won't be the last time that he's sneaky, right? But he's sneaky for a good cause, so we're good with it. Verse 4, Vaydaber Yonatan beDavid tov. Yonatan speaks to his father Shaul good things about David. And what happens when you start talking good about somebody who the person doesn't like? They start to find something bad. You start to, poke the fire, as they say, right? This is actually a concept in halakha. In case you're wondering, there's something called avak lashon hara, the dust of lashon hara. And one of the things the rabbis call avak lashon hara is speaking good things about somebody in the presence of that person who you know doesn't like them, right? So if you start, because you're basically goading that person into saying something negative, because if you know they dislike them, and you start saying good things, the other person can't resist saying, no, they're not that good, they did this, they did that. So you're basically enticing that person to speak lashon hara, and you as the speaker of good, you're going to say, but I only said good things. Yeah, but you led that person to say something bad. That's also a violation. So almost Yonatan over here is performing avak lashon hara. He's trying to goad his father into saying something about David. But that's because he wants to know what's the story over here. He wants to know what's the true colors. is my father really plotting to kill my best friend? So he says good things, El Shaul Aviv, Vayomer Elav. And then Yonatan says to his father, because he knows that his father already told him he wanted to kill him, Al Yecheta HaMelech Be'avdo Be'David. Please let not the king sin against his servant David. He uses that term servant to show David is just a servant. Why are you chasing after him? He didn't do anything against you. And quite the opposite. He's only done positive and good things for you. He's only helped you. He's played the harp for you. He's carried your weapons for you. And look what else he's done, not just for you, but for the Jewish people. Let's not forget he did the greatest thing so far. He killed Goliath, he killed Goliath and saved the Jewish people from the Philistines. Verse 5, he placed his life in his hands. And he smote down the Philistine, talking about Goliath. God made a great salvation for all of the Jewish people. You saw it and you rejoiced about it. Why should you sin and spill innocent blood? To kill David for no reason. So here Yonatan makes an impassioned plea on behalf of his best friend David to the one who wants to kill him and says, why? What reason? Yonatan speaks very rationally. He hasn't done anything negative against you. He's only helped you on a personal level. He's only helped you on a national level in terms of saving the Jewish people. And he's done great things in the eyes of God. How could you spill someone's blood for no reason? And quite the opposite, you'd be repaying him bad for all of the things good that he has done so far. I'd like to point out in verse 5, let's see who remembers back, the language that he uses over here, that God made a teshu'ah gedolah lekol Israel. He made a great salvation for all of the Jewish people. Can anybody recall where the last time we saw that was? It was earlier on in our very same book, having to do with Shaul himself. So I will remind you, I believe it's, if we go back, it's hard to remember all of the, it's not a phrase that you would necessarily see so right away, but it actually appears, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of chapter 11. If you go back to chapter 11, I believe, let me see if I can find it myself. Okay, yeah. If you go, in this book, it's page 661. If you go to page 661, chapter 11, verse 13. So I'll put you back in that scene. Rewind to when Shaul was first chosen to be king. And not everybody was so happy with the decision to choose Shaul to be king, because Shaul was a little bit timid, even though he was very high in stature. But when they appointed him as king, he was hiding. They couldn't find him. He was nechba el hakelim, says the pasuk. Shaul was a very humble person when he first started out. And people were saying, this guy is going to be the king. He can't do anything. He's going to be the king. He can't even stand up and accept the position. He's going to stand up in front of all the enemies and kill them. And then in chapter 11, he does just that. He leads the Jews into battle against Nachash Melech Ammoni, and he wipes them out. And he really asserts himself as the true king. And all of the people come around and say, all right, Shaul, all those naysayers, we should kill them, right? They rebelled against you. They were mocking you. They made fun of you. Now you're the king. You've taken your rightful place as the king of the Jewish people. Get rid of them. And what did Shaul say? In Shaul's humility, he said, absolutely not. Vayomer Shaul, I'll read you the pasuk. It's verse 13 of chapter 11. Shaul says, Lo yumat ish bayom hazeh. I will not put anybody to death on this day. Ki hayom asa Adonai teshu'ah b'Yisrael. Because today God has made a great salvation for the Jewish people. In other words, Shaul set the rule that no matter what a person did on the day that Hashem did a great thing, we don't seek retribution against them, right? Hashem helped Shaul do a great thing for the Jewish people, save them from their enemies. There may have been some naysayers, some people who rebelled against him. We're going to ignore them. We're not going to put anybody to death on the day that Hashem did a great salvation for the Jewish people. That was a rule that Shaul himself put on the books when he first became king. Fast forward back to our chapter. What does his son Yonatan say to his father? He throws it right back at him, right? He says, Dad, you were the one who said that when great things happen for the Jewish people, we don't put people to death. Well, guess what? A great thing happened to the Jewish people, and it happened by the hands of this very man who you want to kill. How could you kill him when he did such a great thing? Your rule was, think back to all those years ago, your rule was we don't kill anybody on the day that something great happened for the Jewish people. So that connection, the word Hashem made a tishu'ah gedolah lechol Israel. Yonatan uses that language to try and trigger his father Shaul to say, yeah, wait a minute, I made that rule. How could I go against my own rule that I was the one who made? And it seems to work. It seems to work very well. Take a look at verse 6. Back in our chapter 19, verse 6, page 685 in my book, 692 in the other one. Vayishma Shaul bekol Yehonatan. Shaul hears, and doesn't just hear, he listens, he internalizes the words of his son Yonatan. Vayishava Shaul. He takes an oath on this day. Chai Adonai im yamut. I swear to God that he will not die. Very severe. He takes an oath in the name of Hashem that he will not put David to death. Okay, so story's over, right? We could skip to the end of the book, right? Not exactly. When something, a ruach ra'ah, a bad spirit comes on the person, he will even go against his own oath. Shaul will ignore his own oath that he made. So here, Yonatan thinks problem solved. My father took an oath. He's not going to kill him. I convinced him. Verse 7, Vayikra Yehonatan to David, Vayaged lo Yehonatan. Yonatan calls to David, and Yonatan tells him, It kol devarim ha'em. He tells him everything that happened. Vayaveh Yehonatan et David el Shaul, and Yonatan brings David to Shaul, Vahi lefanav ke'etmol shilshom. And David is now in the presence of his Yonatan's father Shaul, as he was in the previous days. In other words, it sounds like everything's done, everything's been forgiven, kissing made up, it's all good. We can move on. Not so fast. Because time and again, whenever David has some form of success, it once again triggers inside of Shaul this negative emotion towards David. So we have a little break. We go to verse 8, and now we read about another successful military operation by David. More wars ensue. This has been a staple of Shaul's monarchy, war after war after war, and it will continue into David, mostly with the Philistines, but with other enemies around him. The wars continue. David goes out and he fights against the Philistines. And he smites them down a great destruction. And the Philistines run away, retreat from the Jewish people. Another great victory. And anytime David has a great victory, this arouses jealousy in Shaul. Verse 9, Vatehi ruach Adonai ra'a el Shaul. The spirit of God is evil with Shaul. Vehu bebeto yoshev, and he's now sitting in his home. V'chanito biyado, and his spear is in his hand. We're back to exactly the same scene we were just a chapter ago. Shaul sitting down, he gets this ruach ra'ah, the spear is in his hand, and David is doing what? V'David menagen bayad, and David is playing the harp, trying to keep Shaul at bay. Verse 10, Vayvakesh Shaul lahakot bachanit b'David ubakir. Shaul desires or attempts to hit David and pin him to the wall. Vayiftar mipnei Shaul. But once again, with Hashem's help, David turns away from him. But this time, David notices what happens, and he understands. And David has already been alerted to the fact, as opposed to last chapter where he was oblivious to the idea that Shaul wanted to kill him. David has been growing more and more suspicious of Shaul because of what his friend Yonatan has been telling him. He's a little bit more on edge. And this time when it happens, he throws the spear at him, tries to hit him. David turns away from God. David nas. David ran away. And David escapes on that night. So David now has no doubt that Shaul's true colors have come out. He wants to kill him. And David says, I can't be here. He has to run away. Okay, but Shaul does not stop there. He intensifies his efforts to attack David. Shaul sends messengers to the house of David to watch over him, right? To sort of, I guess, what would you say? Make sure he doesn't go anywhere, right? Surveillance, if you will. And then their job is to kill him in the morning. David tells Michal, his wife. Interesting that here she is referred to as his wife. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Most of the time, we will find Michal referred to as the daughter of Shaul, Bat Shaul. That's how she'll be modified. But here, she's modified as Michal, his wife. And for good reason, because she's going to help him get out of this sticky situation. Exactly. But as we noted in our previous chapter, the relationship between David and Michal will be a up and down one, right? A roller coaster of sorts. There will be times when Michal will be on David's side. There'll be times she has a tough situation to play. On the one hand, it's her father. On the other hand, it's her husband. So, I mean, maybe we've been there before where we have to kind of navigate between our father and our husband. I don't know. Maybe that's come up in our lives at some point. But yeah, she's got a tough job to do. Here it says, "Vataged David Michal ishto lemor im encha memalet et nafshecha halayla machar ata mumat." Michal tells David, if you do not run away tonight, there's no way you're surviving till the morning. In other words, the guards are coming to get you. We got to get you out of here tonight. Now, it's not 100% clear why the guards didn't attack at night. Maybe they were nervous about hurting Michal. Michal is Shaul's daughter. Maybe they were nervous about a mistaken identity or something like that. Maybe Shaul wants him to be specifically killed during the day so you can see. I don't know. It's not clear to me why that was the case, but that's what he was doing. He had instructions to kill him in the morning. So Michal says, we got to take advantage of this night and get you out of here. What does she do? Huh? Okay. So that's got to have something to do with Michal, I would imagine. So what does Michal do? Michal lowers David out of the window. She sneaks him out of the house. And David goes and he runs away and he flees. Verse 13. Michal takes the terafim. We'll stop on that in a minute. And places them in the bed. And she places a net of goat's hair towards the head of where David would have been. And she covers him up with a sheet or some kind of cloth. And in verse 14, Shaul sends the messengers to confiscate David. And she says, he's ill, don't take him now. So again, they're trying, Shaul wants to take David and kill him, but wants to do it gently, so to speak, I guess. So she doesn't, they refrain, right? So Shaul sends the messengers again to go see what's going on with David. And finally he says, I'm not buying the sickness thing anymore. Get him out of the bed and bring the bed with me, bring him up from the bed to me so that I could put him to death. Shaul wants to be the one to put him to death. He believes he's a rebeller against the king. And so Shaul wants to be the one to put him to death. So he wants him alive, not dead. They say, bring him to me.
His messengers to kill. And I said, he could get out of his oath maybe kind of like that because he wasn't the one who did it.
Right.
Yeah, I was like.
Right. So it seems like he's trying to send these messengers and maybe the messengers have the ability to do it. Now he's like, I want to take it to him, bring him to me. Yeah.
What's the thing on the bed?
Okay, I'm gonna get back to the bed. I just want to read the one more pasuk. I didn't forget about the bed. I'm gonna get back to the bed. But it's not over, that's why. Because in verse 16, the malachim come, they find these terafim are in the bed. And it's a goat's hair, net of goat's hair that's at the head. In other words, they realize they've been tricked. So what took place over here? Basically, Michal, for lack of a better analogy, this is an analogy I'll use. I don't know if anybody understands it, but she pulled a Ferris Bueller. Yes? Ferris Bueller's, okay, fine, good. She pulled the Ferris Bueller. She put the guy in, she put these terafim. Now, what these terafim are is a major source of conflict amongst the commentaries. Because where do we know the word terafim from? How do you know that it's
Rachel. Rachel.
From the story of Rachel. Very good, right? Rachel, the last time we've seen terafim was Rachel stole terafim from her father Lavan when they ran away, which the way most of us read that story is she stole the idolatry of her father to get it away from him. That's the way the classic commentaries all explain it. So terafim are idols. But what are idols doing in David's house, right? David is not an idol worshiper. And if we say that he's living in Shaul's house, it doesn't do us any better. Shaul's not an idolater either. So what are these terafim? Where do they come from? So actually, it's this story itself that has other commentaries back in the Chumash by Rachel saying those weren't idols. What Rachel stole from Lavan were not idols at all. You know what they were? They were fortune tellers, essentially, right? They were mechanisms by which Lavan would use to seek out the future, to tell predict what was going to happen in the future. It's like an 8-ball, right? Shake it, will I be lucky? And it gives you like an answer, right? That's basically what the terafim are. They weren't, she took the Ouija board, right? It's not literally idols, but it's something used to try to figure out what will take place in the future. In some ways it is, but the rabbis try to wiggle around and say that if you're using things that you still believe God is telling you a message through them, like for example, Rabbi Shlomo David Luria says this, he says, Shemuel David Luria, he says, if you still believe that Hashem is giving you the answer through this fortune-telling item, so then it's okay, right? Then it's okay. Because what do we use prophets for, if you think about it? We use prophets to ask them questions about what's going to happen in the future. That's not a great answer, because prophets are the legal way that Hashem has given us, because God gives the prophet the answer. Using these other trinkets and other forms of fortune-telling, not great, right? But not necessarily idolatry. It kind of lessens it a little bit. And maybe Michal, the daughter of Shaul, wasn't so in tune with prophets and asking them questions, and maybe she used some of these side things to potentially answer for herself some futuristic questions, right? So, and now you have to also add on that these futuristic things, these terafim, have some kind of form of a human being. Because what does she use them for? She uses them like a mannequin. She uses them to pretend that David is lying in the bed. And she puts the goat's hair at the top as if to mimic David's own hair. So she's using, it is. It's not an easy, I'm with you.
So it's like a prophet that they made themselves. They made, instead of, I don't have a large prophet,
Right.
I'm going to make a fake prophet.
Yeah, but that's a hard thing to say that you could do, right? And I'm making a prophet out of an image of a human being is also very problematic. So it doesn't really help the situation as much. It takes it away from immediate idolatry, but clearly something weird is going on over here. Now, what we will see is that I think, and I saw Rabbi Amnon Bazak in his book tries to explain that what's going on in this story is this is the way of the text to tell us, maybe it's an exaggeration, I don't know, but this is the way the text to tell us that Shaul had a bit of a love-hate relationship with prophets, right? At one point, Shaul was very much in tune with his prophet Shemuel, right? But then Shemuel and Shaul had a falling out to the point where Shaul no longer associates himself with Shemuel. He doesn't speak to him. They don't communicate with each other. And we'll see the story is going to get even more bizarre between Shaul and Shemuel as we go through the chapter. Later in Shaul's tenure, the very last thing that he does, he actually goes through the land of Israel and purges the land of all the fortune tellers and soothsayers and charmers and witches. He purges the land of all of them. But then you know what he does? He needs to ask a question to somebody, and he doesn't go to the Navi. He finds the one woman who he didn't manage to kill, and goes to her to ask a question. So it's really interesting. And we're gonna have to keep this in the back of our minds till we get to the end of the book, because you're gonna see there's a consistency here that you have to follow. There's a train of thought that you have to follow here. But Shaul's relationship with prophets is very tenuous. It's not simple. It's complicated. It's like an ex-girlfriend, right? To give a bad analogy, right?
He likes them if they say what he wants to hear, and if they don't say what he wants to hear, then he doesn't like them.
I hear that 100%, right? And that's who aren't we all like that to a certain degree? We like people who tell us what we want to hear. We shouldn't be. We should be able to hear. But we know that Shaul has had trouble listening to the prophet several times already. Shemuel has given him several instructions that Shaul has not fulfilled. And so Shaul has a very, very tenuous relationship with prophets. And this could be another example of how the tenuous relationship is manifesting in his children. That rather than his children being in tune with Michal, being in tune with the prophet, she's created a pseudo-prophet for herself that's going to tell the future, which I'm not so sure that sits very well with us, right? What David's involvement was in that, we don't really know. But it seems Michal had them in the house. She used them. It is what it is. And here she uses them to actually save David. At least they come in handy in preserving David's life and pretending that he was sick. And David is able to run away. Yeah, go ahead.
She kept them secret, and she had them on account of her barrenness.
She kept them secret, and she had them on account of her barrenness. So we will see that Michal struggles with barrenness, and she'll even be cursed by David himself not to have children after she does something bad to David. And it's interesting that you should bring that up. Did they bring a source? Did they tell you where it's from? The Radak. It'll be the Kimhi, yeah. So the Radak brings this. Now, why is it interesting that you should connect it? Why is it interesting that you should connect it to barrenness? Like who? Like Rachel, right? So now, one second, let's make a connection over here, right? Okay, so the all very much, a lot of people who are barren, but let's focus for a minute on Rachel, because we said, what's the only other time that this idea of terafim has come up? It came up with Rachel. So wait a minute. Rachel's barren, Michal's barren, both have something to do with terafim. What do we say here? It must be that there was this ancient belief that these terafim had some kind of powers to help people with barrenness. Rachel is struggling with barrenness. Maybe she took the terafim not, as we typically understand it, to remove idolatry from her father, but rather she took the terafim because she wanted to use them for herself, right? She was hoping that these terafim, she wanted to take them with her because she was hoping the terafim would work for her for barrenness. And that's, again, it's a very hard thing, because we think of these women, Rachel and Michal, these are matriarchs. These are great people of biblical proportions. Michal, we've had Rachel is one of our foremothers, right? She's one of our matriarchs. But Rachel definitely struggled on her own with a lot of different ups and downs in getting to the point where she could finally pray to Hashem for Hashem to grant her a child. She uses the dudaim, the flowers of jasmine she tries to use. She searches high and low for a lot of different techniques by which to have a child. And who can blame her? Women, anybody who's in such a painful situation, and a woman not being able to conceive a child is perhaps the most painful situation. And when you're in a state of desperation and someone tells you something will work, you'll do anything.
In that way, she was living in the shadow of her sister.
Even harder for her, living in the shadow of her sister who's having 4 and 5 and 6 children. She's struggling to do it. So when a person is in a state of desperation, they're vulnerable, and they hear something will help them in their state, even if it's not always the most straight and honest way of doing things. Who can blame them for grabbing onto something like that? And Rachel goes through that roller coaster, but by the end, the pasuk says that Hashem listened to Rachel's prayers, and that's what gave her Yosef and Binyamin. So she works through it. So maybe that's what's also going here in Michal's case as well. There's a lot to definitely say here, and it's a hard one because we're so emotionally invested in these characters as far as being matriarchs and important women and men. And sometimes it's hard to see that maybe they struggled with some of the things that we ourselves struggle with as well. Let's move to mannequins. That's it. Okay, so I don't want to say a bad thing about anybody here, but the reason is here's a good example, now that you just brought it up, of different books and different commentaries trying to work on a difficult passage. As we know, this is a difficult passage to understand what's happening with terafim. The art scroll, I believe, was written by people who want to try and preserve the honor of the biblical characters, the matriarchs and patriarchs and the wife of David. And so they're gonna, I don't want to say apologize or twist, but they're gonna go in an approach that doesn't shed so much negative light as maybe what we've said as some other commentaries are willing to bring. In my book, the Rabbi Sachs translation, he does not make any qualms about it. He writes, Michal then took the household gods and placed them on the bed. So he's fine with mentioning it that way. So you could see, by the way, how different translators who have different perspectives and different goals will take the same complicated thing and have a hard and try to come in very different ways. And that's why, we say Shivim Panim La Torah. There's 70 angles to Torah, everybody coming from a different approach. And so there's differences that are going to go up over here. They're not going to give you a lot of commentary because, as you see, we haven't done even a great job of explaining it to satisfaction because it's hard to explain really to satisfaction. So they took a couple of mannequins and they put it down. But I think doing that, though, closes the door on something that you have to be able to address. Because if you're reading the text with academic integrity, you have a hard time just glossing over this and not giving something. Wait a minute, if you're reading it in the Hebrew, this jumps out at you in 2 seconds. What's going on? I mean, I tried to skim through it with Barbara. She almost had my head, right? You're not getting away with that, Rabbi, right? Exactly. Many, exactly. You were not letting me get away with that, nor was I trying to. I'm not that type yet. Maybe, I mean, yeah, something else. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. They had a silhouette of a human being to put something on. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We push forward. We're going now into verse 17. We've seen Shaul sending messengers after messengers to try to get David. They seem to constantly slip around. They're using all these tactics. Finally, Shaul gets upset at his daughter. Verse 17. Vayomed Shaul el Michal. Shaul says to Michal, Lama kacha rimitani. Why did you trick me this way? And here again is another allusion to the story of Lavan and Yaakov. Because what does Yaakov say when he gives her Le'ah? Lama rimitani. Why did you trick me? Right? So deception is a hallmark of the stories of Lavan, Yaakov, Rachel, Le'ah. There's a lot of deception here too, for a good cause to save David, who's an innocent victim over here. And he says, you sent away my enemy and he fled. Now Michal says to Shaul, before you read it, what would you think? What would you say if you were Michal and your father accused you of saving your husband, who's his enemy? What would you say?
It depends. If I think my father's going to kill me, then I'd say what she said.
Uh-huh.
But if I think he's a normal person, I would say he's my husband.
Right,
You
right.
know?
So you would,
And
so
you're
maybe.
just-
The truth is, I couldn't agree with you more, right? I mean, if you think that there's a threat here, you're going to try to work around it. So that's what she does. She definitely feels like, hey, I could get the brunt of my father's anger right now for saving his enemy who he wants to kill. He could take it out on me. So Vatomen Michal el Shaul, hu amar elai shalecheni lama amitech. He said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? In other words, Michal says, David threatened me, and if I didn't help him, I was going to die from him, so you can't blame me. Now, we know that that's not true. She obviously made that up because she's afraid that her father will kill her as a result.
But the funny thing is, even if that was true, so then why didn't Shaul say, okay, so once he left your presence, why didn't you call me? Why didn't you run to me? Hours
Right.
and hours passed.
Potentially, yeah.
Nothing.
Why didn't you? So maybe Shaul could be a little bit suspicious of his daughter at this point, but all right, she came up with something, not enough to go after her. Yeah. Maybe some of us feel, I don't know if you feel this way. I mean, because it makes sense to say that she protected herself from her father, but maybe some people feel like, I don't know, I wanted Michal to take a stand no matter what and say something, right? Say, I'm not going to be a party to this. This is my husband. What you're doing is wrong. There's no reason for you to kill him. You gave him to me. You see a little bit of a difference between a person like Yonatan and Michal. Yonatan and Michal are both children of Shaul, but Yonatan, as we shall continue to see, is willing to stand up for his friend and put himself in harm's way. Shaul will try to kill his own son as a result of Yonatan trying to defend David. Michal, maybe she's a little more timid. She's a woman not in a powerful position. She doesn't have the ability to fight back. Maybe we could justify her not taking that stand. But it's interesting that you should compare the two children. Both have a relationship with David. One is willing to stand up to his father, the other not so much. Verse 18, the David barach. Now, if you're David, where do you go? David barach vayimaleh. David runs away and flees. Vayavo el Shemuel haramata. Who does he run away to? He runs to Shemuel. He figures, all right, who's my only defense? The guy who anointed me as the king and the prophet. I'm going to run to Shemuel. Vayagid lo, and he tells him, "Et kol asher asa lo Shaul," everything that's been going on between him and Shaul. Vayelech hu uShmuel vayeshevu benayot. And he and Shemuel realizes now that he's in the presence of David, he's in danger also. They go and they hide away in a place called Nayot. Verse 19, their hiddenness does not stay hidden for long. Vayugad leShaul lemod. It is told to Shaul, saying, Hine David benayot barama. Behold, David is hiding away in Nayot, in the place of Ramah. It doesn't say that Shaul is with him, just says David is hiding. So maybe Shaul had informants, he had loyalists who exposed David's whereabouts to Shaul. And this will happen over and over again. Verse 20, Vayishlach Shaul malachim lakachat et David. Once again, Shaul sends messengers to take David. Vayar et lahakat hanevi'im nibbe'im. Ushmuel omed nitzav alehem. And now something fascinating happens. And it doesn't happen once, doesn't happen twice. It happens 3 different times. What happens? This group of the messengers come upon a group of Nevi'im, of prophets, who are in some kind of a prophetic frenzy. So when a person receives prophecy, they sort of lose control of their faculties, right? It's almost like a seizure-like experience, because a person is overwhelmed by the divine presence that is coming upon them, that is talking to them, that is communicating with them, that the person is no longer in control of their faculties. So they're in a seizure-like thing, and this is what the messengers witness. They witness Shemuel is among them as well, the pasuk tells us. I just lost my voice. Shmuel omed nitzav alehim. Shmuel is also standing among them. So there's a group of these prophets with Shemuel there, and they're in a euphoric, seizure-like prophetic frenzy. Vatehi al malachei Shaul ruach Elohim. And what happens is this prophecy, almost in a contagious way, goes on to the messengers themselves. Even though the messengers are ordinary people, they're not worthy on their own of prophecy, because they're in the presence of all of these prophets experiencing this prophecy. The prophecy goes on them as well. And they too all of a sudden receive prophecy. Now, what is being shown to them? What is being communicated to them? The text does not tell us what exactly it was that they prophesied. But this act of prophecy all of a sudden blocks them, so to speak, from retrieving David to bring them back. Basically, they get lost somehow in them. So what happens in verse 21? Vayagidu leShaul. This word comes back to Shaul. So he tries a second time. Vayishlach malachim achirim. He sends more messengers. Vayitnabeu gamhema. And the same thing happens to them as well. They also come under this prophetic trance. Vayosef Shaul vayishlach malachim shlishim. So Shaul gives it a third time, third choice, a third opportunity. And vayitnabeu gamhema. And it happens a third time. So clearly, Shaul's doesn't seem to be getting the picture here that his messengers are not going to be successful. His attempts, time and again, are futile, right? And so finally, Shaul says, you know what? The messenger thing's not working. I'm going to go myself. And in a minute, we'll analyze a little bit about why Shaul went through all of these messenger situations and what does it show about him. We'll come back to that in a minute. And I also want to parallel this to another story, and that's how we're going to close. Verse 22, Vayelech gamhu haramata. So finally, Shaul gets up, and he too goes to Ramah. Vayavo ad bor hagadol asher basechu. And he comes to the bor hagadol. The bor hagadol seems to be some kind of massive pit, which is in Sechu. It's not really clear from what exactly it was where he was. Here it says in the English, so he himself made his way to Ramah when he reached a great cistern by Sechu. He reached a cistern. Why that's important information, not 100% clear. But he comes to the cistern. Maybe that's where a lot of people are gathering, so he could find somebody. Vayish'al. So he asks one of the inhabitants of the town, Vayomer, and he says, Efo Shmuel v'David. Where are Shmuel v'David? Now that's fascinating that he should ask that question. Why is that so interesting? Because he doesn't know that Shemuel is there. He doesn't know. If you recall earlier in verse 19, it says that people told him where David was. So he was sending the messengers to get David. Nobody told him anything about Shemuel. So all of a sudden, Shaul figures out on his own, Shemuel must be there. That's where David is seeking refuge. And for nivu'ah, for prophecy to come on all of these different people that I'm sending, there's got to be a prophet there. Shemuel must have been there, right? And Shaul knows this very well because, I'm going to go back into our memories as we typically do. When Shaul was first crowned as king, Shemuel the prophet gave him a number of signs. I don't know if you remember that story. It's in chapter 9. He gave him a bunch of signs to show him that he was really the king. And one of those signs was that Shaul came across a group of prophets. And what happened to him when he came across a group of prophets? He too received prophecy. And there, the people who saw Shaul get the prophecy, they said, Hagam Shaul b'nevi'im? Where did this guy come from that he should be among the prophets to receive prophecy? So Shaul knows full well that the only way ordinary people who are not typically prophets receive prophecy is if they're what? If they're around and among the presence of other prophets. So he figures out on his own, Shemuel must be here. Now look what happens to Shaul. Fascinating. I think we even referenced this chapter when we learned it back in chapter 9 and 10, if you recall. So he says, Efo Shemuel v'David. Where are Shemuel and David? Vayomer, and they say to him, Hine b'Nayot barama. They're in Nayot in the place of Ramah. So he goes there. Vayelech sham el Nayot barama. He goes to Nayot. Vatehi alav gamhu ruach Elohim. And already, as he's approaching them, he hasn't even came into their presence. He's approaching them. All of a sudden, the prophecy of God falls upon Shaul. Vayelech haloch vayitnabeh. And he's walking and getting closer to them and prophesying the whole time. Ad bo'o b'nayot barama, until he actually reaches the place where Shaul and David are. Verse 24, Vayivshat gamhu begadav. He too takes off his clothing. Vayitnabe gamhu lifnei Shmuel. And he prophesies before Shmuel. Vayipol arom, and he falls naked. Kol hayom hahu v'chol halayla, for the entire duration of the day and night. Al ken yomeru. For this reason, the people say, Hagam Shaul b'nevi'im. Is Shaul also amongst the prophets? And that's how the chapter ends. Bizarre, but really, really one of those stranger encounters that we found in this entire book about what's going on. And that's how the story ends. And in the next chapter, it's going to tell us that David is able to flee and run away because Shaul experienced these prophetic bouts, this prophetic frenzy, and David is able to escape. What is going on here? Like, what is the takeaway for the reader? How do we make sense of all of this that's sort of going on? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. Oh, okay, so Lori hit a good theme, right? We've seen already a few times the symbolism of what? Taking off your clothing, right? We saw Shaul take off his armor and give it to David. We saw Yonatan take off his cloak and give it to David, right? So we've seen this idea of taking off your clothes and giving it to someone as a show of transference of power. And here, what is it? It just tells us that Shaul took off his clothing. He didn't give it to anybody. Here, I think it's kind of a message about how far Shaul has deteriorated, where he's gotten to a point where he's prophesying and naked in a prophetic frenzy with removing his clothes, basically saying this is his last encounter among the prophets. This is going to be our last image of Shaul in the presence of Shemuel, and it's one that does not give a very positive, high image of the king of the Jewish people. It's almost a sign to him, look where you've come to. You can only get prophecy in the presence of these people who you tried to kill, and in the end you lay sort of ashamed almost because of your deterioration from where these people are, right? Just removed of your clothing, basically. So that could be one idea. And the phrase Hagam Shaul b'nevi'im, again, bookmarks where Shaul started and where Shaul ended. He started with all of this promise as the king of the Jewish people. His first sign was that he's going to prophesy, and people are like, wow, Hagam Shaul b'nevi'im. And where does he end up? Here, Hagam Shaul b'nevi'im is Shaul's amongst the prophets. look where he's gotten to, right? So we see the downward spiral that Shaul unfortunately has taken because of his own decision-making and poor decision-making processes, missteps that are there. And this can happen. If it can happen to Shaul, it could happen to any one of us.
I'm thinking
Go ahead.
that he heard prophecies from God that were very negative to him, and he realized it's over. I'm
Right.
finished.
Right. So that could also be what he's prophesying about, that he's getting the message loud and clear that his tenure is up. Right. The question is, how will he respond to that? Perhaps the response should be at that point to recede into the night and to cease and desist, as we will see, but that will not be what Shaul ends up doing.
That's not his theme.
It's unfortunately not Shaul's theme. Yes, it is not a very good one. Yeah. I want to make two more quick points before we end. The fact that Shaul is constantly sending messengers to do his work. In this chapter, we constantly hear he sent messengers, he sent messengers, he sent messengers. Why is the text emphasizing so many times how much he sent messengers? What does it represent? Huh?
Maybe he's really afraid because he does not have the Ruach HaKodesh. So he has evil Ruach, and David does.
Right. So what is it? So what is it saying? It's saying what?
So he's afraid to approach.
He's afraid. So his fear. I think that's really the big thing. When you send what? Yeah. Kings operate. You could say kings operate a little bit with messengers, but if something meant so, look at the end. He gets up and does it himself. If in the end of the day something is meaningful to you, you get up and you do it yourself, even if you're a king. So I understand the idea of being a king, but I think the sending of messengers typically represents the idea that the king himself understands the immorality of what he's doing. So he's sending somebody else to do it so that he can be removed from the situation. He's sending a messenger. When somebody knows that they're doing something wrong themselves and they feel that inside of them, they typically want to distance themselves. Think of, like, I hate to make the analogy because Shaul is not that, but a mafia type person. Mafia people send others to put the hit on them, right? Because they want to be removed from that, understanding the immorality and unethical behavior that they're about to conduct. So they send messengers. To a certain degree, that's kind of what the text is hinting to us here with Shaul, that even Shaul understands that he is being unethical in the way he's trying to treat David, but he can't help himself, right? Something has gripped him and come over him that he can't help himself. And hence, he keeps sending the messengers, and until finally he gets the message that the messengers are failing time and again, does he himself get up to go ahead and do it. Now, I want to, as our last point, we're going to fast forward to another story, and I want to show you again this idea of how bad it is when a king sends messengers to do his dirty work, and what Shaul is maybe being compared to here. It's a story that's going to take place later on, way later. We may get to it someday in the book of Kings. In the book of Kings. So if you have this book in front of you, I have it bookmarked. It's on page 865. Okay, way later, page 865. It's in the book of Kings, chapter 22, where way later into the time of Eliyahu Hanavi. Okay, so we know at least the name Eliyahu Hanavi. We're in the time of Eliyahu Hanavi. And Eliyahu had to deal with a lot of very evil kings in his time period. Okay, and one of those evil kings was a man by the name of Achav, who was really bad. And then Achav has a son whose name is, I believe it's Achaziah, Achaz or Achaziah. That's his what's his name? Achav's son. So Achaz holds on to the bad ways of his father Achav, and so look what happens. I'm gonna open up here for our watchers on the. It's actually the last chapter of the book of Kings, of the book of Kings 1. So what happens over here? This son Achaziah falls ill. He gets sick. He's a bad king. God's smiting him with an illness. But what does he do? He tries to send messengers to go ask the local avodah zarah, the local idolatry, whether he's going to get better. The name of this idolatry is called Baal Zevuv. Zevuv is a fly. So he's asking the fly idolatry if he's going to get better, right? This is the god of Ekron. So I'll summarize because we're under the gun. What happens? God comes to Eliyahu Navi and says, Eliyahu, I want you to meet the messengers who are going to ask the avodah zarah about the king's health. I want you to meet them and send a message to them back to the king saying, are there no prophets in the land that you could ask a prophet instead of asking the avodah zarah? So Eliyahu sends this message back to the messengers. The messengers don't know who Eliyahu is. The messengers go back to the king. The king says, what are you doing here? They say, oh, well, we met someone on the way, and he told us to tell you that God says, are there no prophets in the land that you could ask the prophets instead of asking the Avodah Zarah? King says, what did this man look like? They describe the man, and the king says, I know who that is. That's the troublemaker, Eliyahu, because he's been making trouble for my father, and now he's making trouble for me also. He says, you know what we're going to do? Let's send people to go kill him. Take a look, right? I'll read from the English just to save us some time, right? If you're there on page 865, it's where is it? Verse 9, right? Verse 9, it starts over here. It says, so the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, bring Micha, son of Amaliah at once. Where am I? No, am I in the right spot? Melachim. Oh, sorry. It's actually not, I'm in the wrong spot. My mistake. It's actually the first chapter of Melachim Bet. It's the same page. It's the same page, but it's actually the first chapter of Melachim Bet. Sorry, not the last chapter of Melachim. Here. He says, then he sent him to a captain of 50 with his 50 men. He climbed up to him and found him sitting on the top of the hill. Man of God, he said to him, by order of the king, come down. So they're telling Eliyahu, come down the mountain. We want to kill you. Eliyahu says to them, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you with 50 men. And fire came down from heaven and consumed him and the 50 men. Miracle. A fire from heaven comes, kills all the people. The king sent another 50 men. And he addressed them as follows, man of God, by order of the king, come down at once. Sounds like something out of a child's book. Eliyahu answered them, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from the heavens and consume you and the 50 men. And fire of God came down from the heavens and consumed him and the 50 men. So twice the king keeps sending more and more people, and each time fire's coming down. Finally, the third guy gets sent. Then he sent the third captain of 50 with his 50 men. Now this third captain of 50, if you were him, what are you thinking to yourself? I'm not going. It's a suicide mission. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to get the king. So the third guy with his 50 men, he comes to the top and he bows down to Eliyahu. And he says to him, oh man of God, please have regard for my life and the lives of the 50 servants of yours. He's like, please don't kill us, right? I'm here because the king sent me. What am I going to do? But please don't kill us like the other guys. He tells him, okay, already fire has come from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and 50 of their men. I beg you, have regard for my life, right? And so he spares them. He doesn't end up killing them, right? And that's the story, right? Why do I reference this story? It's very similar to the story that we're reading about as us, a king sending messengers to kill a great person, and these people are getting consumed in what's happening. They can't fulfill the mission. And finally, the third group of people are basically saying, stop us, right? We don't want to do it. Now, where's the difference in the story? The difference in the story is, in this story about Achaz, the people recognized what they did wrong. The third guy's coming and saying, please don't kill me, right? The third guy is what Shaul should really be doing, right? Shaul should have realized after sending the first guy and the second guy and the third guy. Okay, something's not happening here, right? I gotta turn back, right? Shaul is being gripped. He's lost, right? And so in this parallel, Shaul is similar to the idolatrous king. He's the same as Achaz. Achaz is asking for the idolatry from his move to find out what it is. Shaul is doing a similar thing. You try once, you try twice, you try 3 times, you're beating down on a dead horse, and you're not getting the message that God is trying to send, that what you're doing, your endeavors are the wrong thing. You're acting in the wrong way. So it's a hard thing to say. I don't want to go there.
There's no fear.
Right.
It doesn't happen.
It's definitely true that at this point, Shaul has lost his sense of reality. There's no question. Shaul has deteriorated to a point where the jealousy, the ruach ra'ah, the things that have gripped him, the hatred for something, and as great a person as Shaul is, it's always important at the end to just remind you, we're talking about a man, Shaul, who at one point was Shemuel Vamala. He was the king. He was the chosen one, right? And he's still in our lexicon of Jewish biblical figures is still considered great. He is. Yes, he is by most rabbinic sources more positive than negative, as crazy as that sounds, because of all of the craziness that we're seeing. That's why it's the ruach ra'ah that's gripping him. In the end of the day, that's why you got to trace the story all the way to the end. When we get to the end, you'll see how Shaul doubles back. He has remorse for what he's been doing. He tries to make a covenant with David. We got to follow the story till the end. You can't stop the story here. If you stop the story here, you'd come out with that outcome, right? That this guy's just lost his mind. And to a certain degree, he has lost the sense of reality with everything that has taken place. He'll get a little bit of that back. But this is what could happen to a people. The major biblical lesson that we're learning here is that even the greatest of people, when they're overcome by these types of jealousy and anger and hatred, he takes you out of the reality of the world. And our rabbis say this, kina'at, ta'ava, and kavod, jealousy, desire, temptation, and honor, motzi'ina ta'adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of the reality of the world. You're living in your own imagination, your own world, your own fantasy land. And that's where Shaul is living. To the point that we as the readers want to take Shaul and say, wake up, like, what are you doing? Don't you know God? Don't you see what's happening? But he can't get a grip with reality because he's being gripped by all of these negative emotions on the side. We'll continue to trace Shaul and David and their tense relationship and what's going on and how Shaul tries to find a way back, has to get a way back to what's going on. We'll see that as we read the coming chapters. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Questions or thoughts before we end? Yeah, go ahead.
So I noticed in this chapter, when it talks about Yonatan, in the Hebrew side, they added the he in his name. Is that because now he also had the Ruach of Hashem when he...
Why do they add the he for Yehonatan? We've seen Yonatan's name go like back and forth, Yonatan or Yehonatan. Yeah, I think when Yonatan is putting himself out there for the sake of his brother David, for the sake of his, like say brother in quotes, his friend David, I think the text puts that hey in there to show like his connection, his devotion, his loyalty to David, loyalty to Hashem, putting himself aside because Yonatan should have been the next king for his friend David. So maybe that's what it has to do a little bit with. But I don't know that I'm aware personally. I'll have to do some research of a clear, consistent theme of why the hay is sometimes there and not there, depending on the story. No, it didn't just change one time. My sense is that it goes back and forth with the hay, without the hay. Don't forget, the book is written by a human being. It's different than the Torah, which is written by God directly. Navi is written by a human being with divine providence, with divine intervention, divine assistance, so to speak. But sometimes those little nuances don't really strike anything with the read. But I'll take a look and see. That's my best guess. Best guess that I have. Yeah.